Hey guys, tonight we are floating gently across a mirror-bright lake, the kind of water that looks as though it could swallow both sky and canoe without a ripple. The morning mist clings low, and you can just make out the outlines of strange rectangles that seem to hover on the water's surface. Birds wheel overhead, and reeds whisper along the edges. You realize you're not looking at ordinary islands. You're drifting into a world where gardens float like green carpets stitched to the lake itself. Of course, you probably wouldn't survive this for very long. Between the relentless mosquitoes, the damp air, and the need to paddle everywhere in a wobbly canoe, most modern folks would be booking the first flight back to their couch. But the Aztec farmers thrived here, turning watery landscapes into fields that fed hundreds of thousands of people. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment with your location and the local time you're listening. It always amazes me how this sleepy little corner of history reaches people from all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The canoe glides closer, and you can smell the damp earth, rich and sweet, carried across the surface of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs called these floating fields chinampas, and to the untrained eye they look like patches of solid ground. But when you lean over the side, you can see that beneath the surface, they're woven from reeds, mud, and clever engineering. Mainstream history confirms that these chinampas allowed the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to flourish, providing food in vast quantities. Yet, here's the quirky tidbit. Travelers from Europe at first didn't believe they were man-made. They thought the islands must have been naturally grown. It was only when locals laughed and explained the weaving of reeds and piling of mud that the truth came out. Historians still argue whether the system was truly as extensive as later accounts describe. Some suggest the chinampas covered thousands of acres, while others believe the records exaggerated, their authors dazzled by the sheer novelty of the site. Whatever the scale, drifting here at dawn, you see enough to be convinced that water and earth have been coaxed into a kind of miracle. The lake air is cool, tinged with the scent of wet reeds, as a farmer kneels on one of the gardens, planting seedlings in straight lines. You float past in silence, watching the rows of maize stretch into the mist, the first light gilding their edges. These are not ordinary fields. They are floating tapestries, stitched by human hands into the skin of a lake. You paddle closer to the edge of one of these islands, and now you can see the secret beneath its calm green surface. Layers of reeds, mud, and lake weeds are piled and woven together, lashed down with stakes until they become something that looks almost like land. The water laps softly against the sides, but the whole thing feels steady under the farmer's bare feet. Mainstream history explains that the chinampa system was first developed centuries before the height of the Aztec Empire. Farmers realized that by staking out sections of shallow lake and piling them with fertile mud, they could create artificial plots of land that never ran out of water. These gardens weren't temporary tricks. They became permanent fields, lasting for generations as families maintained and rebuilt them. Here's the quirky tidbit. Early Spanish observers described chinampas as gardens that walk. They swore the islands drifted around the lake, only to realize later that willows and stakes anchored them in place. Imagine chasing your vegetable patch across the water like a runaway raft. It's not exactly the kind of farming most of us picture. Historians still argue whether the first chinampas were meant for food production or for ceremonial gardens. Some evidence suggests that the earliest floating plots may have been used to grow flowers and offerings for temples before becoming the backbone of agriculture. Were they born as sacred decoration or as survival innovation? The debate drifts on like a canoe in the fog. You drift nearer, watching a farmer in a woven straw hat kneel to press maize kernels into the damp soil. His canoe rests against the edge, half full of seedlings waiting for transplant. Birds settle on the willows nearby, their roots gripping the waterlogged ground. The whole scene feels both precarious and eternal, as if these floating gardens belong as naturally to the lake as reeds or lilies. The water slaps gently against your canoe, and you imagine the patience it took to build each one of these floating fields by hand. With every scoop of mud, every armful of reeds, the Aztec farmers reshaped not just the lake, but their own destiny, anchoring survival to ingenuity in the quiet dawn light. Your canoe glides further into the maze of islands, and the view suddenly widens. Field after field of green stretching across the water like a patchwork quilt. The sun rises higher, and you see farmers already hard at work, their canoes stacked with seedlings, baskets, and tools. The quiet rhythm of labor is everywhere, yet no one seems rushed. Mainstream history confirms that these Chinampas fed Tenochtitlan, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, with a population estimated at over 200,000. From maize to beans, squash, chilies, and even flowers, the floating gardens supplied a steady stream of food, supporting markets that bustled daily with fresh produce. Without them, the city could not have thrived on its watery island. Here's the quirky tidbit. Spanish chroniclers claimed that the sheer abundance of food grown on chinampas made Aztec markets smell sweeter than any they had known in Europe. Imagine walking into a marketplace and being greeted by the aroma of chilies, herbs, and fresh maize bread instead of fish guts and sour ale. Not a bad upgrade. Historians still argue whether chinampas alone could feed the entire city, or if tribute from conquered regions was equally crucial. Some argue that local production was enough to sustain urban life, while others believe the empire's tributary system shouldered much of the burden. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, the lake field serving as the steady heartbeat, while tribute added seasonal bounty. You drift past one family harvesting beans, their hands moving quickly, dropping pods into baskets that fill with quiet clunks. In another field, children pluck chilies, their laughter echoing faintly across the water. Canoes bump gently at the edges of islands, like little floating delivery carts ready to head toward market. The scale overwhelms you. This is no quaint garden, no novelty for a handful of households. It's a carefully engineered landscape, transforming lake into farmland, and farmland into a city's lifeline. With every row of maize, every hill of beans, the floating gardens stitch the metropolis together, one quiet harvest at a time. Your paddle cuts the water in slow arcs, and you move toward the edges of a chinampa, where the soil looks unusually dark, damp, and rich. A farmer dips a wide wooden scoop into the lake, hauling up clumps of mud heavy with weeds and silt. He spreads it across the field, and suddenly you understand the secret of these floating farms. They aren't just built once and forgotten, they're constantly fed. Mainstream history records that the Aztecs maintained fertility by dredging mud from the bottom of the lake and layering it onto their fields. This sediment was packed with nutrients, replenishing the soil year after year. Unlike many medieval farms in Europe that suffered from exhaustion, chinampas could produce crops in multiple cycles annually, turning the lake itself into a renewable resource. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim that farmers worked barefoot, feeling for the best muck with their toes before scooping it up. Imagine doing quality control with your feet. It's one way to get very personally acquainted with your ingredients. Historians still argue whether dredging was enough to keep yields so high, or if farmers also relied heavily on organic waste, compost, or even fish remains mixed into the soil. Was it mud alone that fed Tenochtitlan, or was there a hidden recipe of nutrient cocktails beneath each row of maize? The truth remains somewhere in the fertile, murky depths. You watch the farmer shovel more sediment, his canoe rocking gently as he balances the load. Each scoop darkens the soil, soft and crumbly, ready to cradle seeds again. You notice how the lake, instead of being an obstacle, becomes part of the farm itself, feeding the fields just as surely as it surrounds them. The silence of the morning is punctuated by the soft splash of water and the rhythmic scrape of the paddle against the mud. As the Chinampa grows richer, you can almost hear the city it feeds stirring awake in the distance. The fields are alive, not just with crops, but with the quiet hum of ingenuity, one scoop of lake bed at a time. Your canoe drifts to the edge of another Chinampa, and you notice something different here. Tall, slender trees rise at the corners, their roots tangled deep into waterlogged soil. Their leaves flutter softly in the morning breeze, casting long shadows over rows of maize and beans. The floating garden doesn't just float aimlessly. These trees act like anchors, pinning each island into place. Mainstream history explains that willows, called ahuejotes in Nahuatl, were planted along the borders of Chinampas. Their roots grew downward and outward, knitting soil, reeds, and mud into a firm structure that resisted erosion. Without them, the islands would have dissolved back into the lake within a season. With them, Chinampas could endure for decades, even centuries, passed down through families as inherited plots. Here's the quirky tidbit. The willows weren't only anchors. Their branches were trimmed regularly to provide firewood, stakes, and even shade for delicate crops. They were multitasking guardians, structural engineers, resource providers, and occasional bird perches. Imagine a tree doing the job of scaffolding, fence posts, and pantry all at once. Historians still argue whether the use of willows was an intentional design from the very beginning or a clever adjustment developed later. Did the first Chinampa farmers immediately realize they needed tree anchors? Or did they discover it after losing a few islands to waves and wind? The debate lingers like ripples on the lake. You lean back in your canoe and watch one farmer tending his willows, trimming small branches and pushing them into the soil to root as new saplings. The cycle is endless. Trees beget more trees, and with each one, the Chinampa grows stronger. The silence is punctuated by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a heron, the garden anchored in both earth and air. With every breath of wind, the willows sigh, and the islands seem to whisper that they belong here as much as any mountain or plain. Though born entirely of human patience, mud, and roots, the sun climbs higher now, glinting off the water as you drift past another cluster of Chinampas. Canoes slip silently along the narrow canals, their wakes spreading in soft ripples. On each island, men and women kneel in the soil, their hands busy with seedlings, their motions calm and practiced, like dancers repeating steps learned long ago. Mainstream history notes that the daily rhythm of Chinampa farmers was relentless but steady. They woke with the dawn, ferried tools and seedlings out to their plots, planted maize in neat rows, tucked beans beside the stalks, and scattered squash vines along the edges. By weaving these three sisters together, they maximize space and nutrients, creating fields that practically cared for themselves. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention that farmers marked their plots with little idols or charms, tiny clay figures tucked into the soil for luck. Imagine treating your vegetable patch like a desk cubicle, complete with good luck trinkets watching over the beans. Historians still argue whether Chinampa farmers worked in organized rotations commanded by the state, or whether most plots were privately managed family holdings. Were they laborers bound to the empire's demands, or independent farmers paddling their own way? The debate flows endlessly, like water between the rows. You sit back in your canoe, watching a boy push a canoe piled high with maize stalks, while an old woman gently waters chili plants from a clay jar. The air hums with insects, the breeze rustles the willows, and the silence of work becomes a chorus of small sounds. No rush, no shouting, just the steady, timeless routine of planting and tending. The lake reflects their movements, so the farmers seem doubled, one above, one below, working in mirror harmony. It feels like a kind of prayer, this quiet routine, binding families to the floating earth that feeds both them and the great city rising just beyond the mist. The air is warmer now, and the smell of earth mingles with the sharper scent of roasted chilies wafting from a canoe headed toward the city. You pause, watching a farmer pause as well, pressing kernels of maize into the damp soil with a kind of reverence. To him, this isn't just planting, it's devotion. Mainstream history tells us that maize, or corn, held sacred importance for the Aztecs. It was more than food. It was a divine gift tied to myths of creation. According to Nahua belief, humans were fashioned from maize dough by the gods themselves. To plant corn, then, was not merely agricultural work. It was reenacting the story of human origins. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some farmers carried little figurines of Centeotl, the maize deity, placing them at the edges of chinampas to bless the crop. It's the ancient equivalent of putting a garden gnome in your backyard, except your plastic figurine doesn't decide your afterlife. Historians still argue whether every Chinampa farmer treated their fields as sacred spaces, or whether these rituals were more symbolic, performed only at communal festivals. Was every row of corn a prayer, or were some just plain dinner? The evidence is uneven, caught between myth and practice. You drift closer, and the farmer straightens, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His maize stalks rise tall already, beans winding upward like green ribbons, squash vines curling outward, promising golden blossoms. You can hear the soft rustle of the plants as if they're whispering their story back to you. Humans made of corn, fields feeding gods and people alike. The cycle repeating endlessly across the floating gardens. The canoe rocks gently beneath you, and you realize the maize fields are not just food. They're living scripture, swaying quietly in the wind. The sun sits high now, reflecting in sharp shards across the rippling lake, and the steady rhythm of paddles grows louder as canoes stream toward the city. Some carry baskets of beans and chilies, others heaped with herbs, squash blossoms, and maize still damp with dew. The waterway feels like a marketplace on the move. Mainstream history tells us that Tenochtitlan's great markets were supplied daily by these chinampas. The central market at Tlatelolco is said to have hosted tens of thousands of buyers and sellers, a sight so overwhelming that even hardened Spanish conquistadors wrote about it with awe. The produce from the floating gardens was a constant presence, ensuring that the city never starved, no matter how vast its population. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers specialized in growing flowers instead of food. These blossoms weren't just for beauty. They were sold for temple rituals, festivals, and even household decoration. Picture rows of marigolds and dahlias floating on the lake, destined to brighten both shrines and dinner tables. Even in a city of stone and canals, people wanted their equivalent of fresh-cut bouquets. Historians still argue whether the Shinampas truly provided enough surplus to create that market abundance, or if tribute from conquered territories filled in the gaps. Were the floating gardens the true breadbasket of the city, or only part of a larger imperial machine? The question lingers, like the scent of chilies drifting on the air. You steer into a canal choked with boats, where traders laugh softly, exchange goods, and pass gossip along with baskets. The silence of the fields has given way to a muted hum of voices, punctuated by the calls of water birds. From here, you can almost see the towering temples of the city in the distance, their stone faces looking down at the bustling flow of food. Everywhere you turn, the floating gardens ripple outward into the life of the metropolis, feeding its people, filling its markets, and weaving lake and city together like threads of the same cloth. The city grows larger on the horizon, temples rising like mountains from the lake, and yet the canals around you remain crowded with boats piled high with food. The water itself feels like a marketplace, a moving artery feeding the heart of Tenochtitlan. You trail your hand in the cool ripples and watch as traders guide their canoes with practiced strokes, each one heavy with the bounty of floating fields. Mainstream history notes that canals were not just irrigation channels, but highways. Goods traveled seamlessly from chinampas to markets with no need for carts or roads. Canoes carried maize, beans, flowers, firewood, and even people, entire families ferrying themselves to and from the gardens. Water, which elsewhere might divide communities, here stitched everything together into one living network. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe canoes so carefully loaded that they resembled floating pyramids of produce. Piles of maize stalks, beans, and flowers balanced improbably high, wobbling slightly, but somehow staying intact. Imagine your grocery run looking like a parade float and paddling it through traffic. Historians still argue whether these canals were originally natural waterways adapted for farming, or if they were engineered deliberately into a planned system. Did the Aztecs carve them with intention from the start, or did centuries of gradual tinkering transform marsh into metropolis? The argument lingers, like echoes of oars striking water. You pass beneath the shadow of a wooden bridge, its surface bustling with people crossing from one side of the city to the other. A canoe loaded with chilies glides past, its owner nodding silently, while another stacked with flowers leaves a faint trail of petals in the water. The canals pulse like veins, carrying life into every corner of the city, each boat a heartbeat. And as you drift in their midst, lulled by the dip and splash of paddles, you realize you're not just watching farming. You're watching an entire civilization float, glide, and grow, carried effortlessly on the water's surface. The canals wind like ribbons, leading you into quieter stretches of water where the city's noise is softened by distance. Here, the air feels cooler, touched by the scent of incense drifting faintly from unseen temples. On the banks of Chinampas, you notice small altars, simple stone slabs decorated with flowers, feathers, and bits of food. This is not only farming, it's ritual. Mainstream history tells us that the Aztecs tied agriculture tightly to religion. Deities like Tlaloc, the rain god, and Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of lakes and rivers, were honored with offerings to ensure steady water and fertile soil. Every harvest wasn't just a cycle of crops. It was a covenant with the divine, reaffirmed with ceremony. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers reportedly offered the first fish caught in the canals or the first handful of maize to the gods before eating themselves. Imagine standing at your fridge and handing your sandwich to a household altar before taking a bite. Divine tax in its most literal form. Historians still argue whether these offerings were performed daily at the level of each family plot or only during larger, state-sponsored rituals. Did every Chinampa hum with quiet ceremonies each dawn, or did the gods receive their due only in public festivals? The evidence remains as slippery as the fish darting through the canals. You watch as a farmer places a garland of marigolds on the edge of his plot, then sprinkles a few kernels into the water. He bows once and turns back to his work, the gesture unremarkable to him, yet it feels profound to you. Around him, the lake mirrors the sky, and the Chinampas ripple outward like a living prayer mat. In this silent fusion of farming and faith, you sense how the Aztecs wove sustenance and spirituality into one seamless fabric. Each stalk of maize, each splash of paddle, each bloom of marigold whispered thanks to gods who, in their eyes, made the gardens float. You paddle further along the canals, and the calm hum of daily life feels suddenly broken by a sharper echo. Foreign voices, metal clanking, and the splash of oars not shaped like the Aztec paddles. The air seems heavier, as though history itself has shifted, and soon you glimpse figures who do not belong here. Spaniards stepping clumsily into canoes, staring wide-eyed at the floating gardens. Mainstream history confirms that when Hernán Cortés and his men first reached the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were astonished by what they saw. Chroniclers wrote of a city gleaming on the water, threaded with canals, surrounded by fields that seemed to grow straight out of the lake. The Chinampas impressed them as marvels of engineering, equal to anything in Europe. Here's the quirky tidbit. One Spanish observer described the floating gardens as sailing fields, convinced they moved about like ships. He claimed to have seen them drift across the lake, as if the maize itself was rowing toward the market. Clearly, he hadn't noticed the willows doing their quiet anchoring work. Historians still argue whether the Spaniards truly appreciated the scale of the Chinampa system, or whether their writings exaggerated, dazzled by novelty, and eager to impress audiences back home. Were they recording an accurate agricultural wonder, or crafting tales that blended fact with spectacle? The debate lingers, like the haze over the water. You watch a Spaniard reach down, scoop a handful of mud, and sniff it suspiciously, while Aztec farmers continue their work with calm indifference. The invaders marvel, but they do not understand. They see crops and canals, but miss the centuries of knowledge, ritual, and resilience woven into each floating garden. The moment feels fragile, suspended like a canoe mid-current. You sense how easily admiration can shift into conquest, how quickly the quiet rhythm of Chinampa life would be disrupted by new voices, new laws, and new hungers that the lake had never known. The water grows quieter again, but the mood is changed. Canoes move more cautiously. Farmers glance toward the horizon, and the silence of work feels heavier, as though everyone can sense a storm beyond the mist. You see a man dragging reeds across his Chinampa, piling mud as always, but his motions seem slower, more deliberate, like someone clinging to habit even as the world shifts. Mainstream history records that after the Spanish conquest, the Chinampa system began to unravel. Warfare, disease, and forced labor devastated the population, leaving fewer hands to tend the floating gardens. Fields that once produced multiple harvests a year slipped into neglect, their edges crumbling into the lake. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that Spaniards, rather than abandoning the Chinampas immediately, actually tried to use them. They marveled at the yields, but were less interested in maintaining the delicate balance of dredging and replanting. Picture conquistadors trying to farm like Aztec gardeners, armor clanking, mud squelching around their boots, only to give up when the first crop flopped. Historians still argue whether the decline of Chinampas was inevitable due to conquest and disease, or whether the system could have survived if Spaniards had embraced and supported it fully. Was it cultural suppression that doomed them, or the sheer collapse of the population that once worked the fields? The truth remains murky, much like the lake's sediment itself. You float past abandoned Chinampas, where willows lean crookedly and maize rows stand half-planted. The water encroaches, reeds reclaiming edges, and the silence here is not peaceful but somber. Yet in the distance, you still glimpse farmers who endure, families who continue to paddle out, to dredge mud, to plant seedlings, carrying on traditions even in the shadow of upheaval. The floating gardens survive, but fewer now, scattered like fragments of a memory across the water. Their persistence feels fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind, yet it refuses to go out. The sun tilts westward, and the lake's shimmer grows softer, painted in gold. Your canoe drifts into an area where voices rise again, not in Nahuatl chants of long ago, but in Spanish, then later, in modern Spanish-inflected echoes. Against all odds, the Chinampas are still here, centuries after conquest and upheaval. Mainstream history tells us that while many floating gardens faded, some endured in hidden corners. Today, the Chinampas of Xochimilco in Mexico City are the living remnants of that system. Farmers there still dredge mud, still plant maize, beans, chilies, and flowers, and still guide canoes through the winding canals. It's not the empire of Tenochtitlan, but a quieter survival. Here's the quirky tidbit. In the modern era, some Chinampas switched from maize to growing vegetables destined for upscale restaurants in Mexico City. Imagine the same method that once fed emperors, now supplying farm-to-table zucchini for hipster brunches. A continuity both humbling and a little amusing. Historians still argue whether the Xochimilco Chinampas are truly direct descendants of Aztec-era gardens, or whether they've been reshaped so many times that they're more a modern revival than an unbroken tradition. Is it authentic continuity, or a clever reconstruction of the past? The debate flows on, like the canal water itself. You watch a modern farmer, his hands weathered but steady, scatter seedlings into rows of soil that sit atop water. Behind him, brightly painted trajineras, flat-bottomed tourist boats, float past with music and laughter, a surreal blend of past and present. The silence of monks or conquistadors is gone, replaced with guitars, chatter, and mariachi horns. And yet, beneath the noise, the Chinampas remain. Anchored by willows, fed by mud, resilient as ever, they continue their quiet work. You realize you're not just gliding through history, you're gliding through survival, ingenuity that has lasted nearly a millennium and still feeds people today. Your canoe glides deeper into the canals of Xochimilco, where the lake narrows and the chatter of tourists fades. Here, the water is quiet again, lined by willows whose roots curl into the soil like old hands. Farmers bend over their plots just as their ancestors once did, dredging mud, planting seedlings, whispering to the earth. Yet behind this continuity lies debate, because even in still water, questions ripple. Mainstream history acknowledges the brilliance of the Chinampa system, but modern scholars wrestle with how to interpret it. Some insist it was the single most productive agricultural method of the pre-Columbian Americas, capable of yielding up to 7 harvests a year. Others argue the figures are romantic exaggerations, numbers inflated by early colonial writers dazzled by novelty. Here's the quirky tidbit. In the 1970s, experimental farmers in Mexico City actually rebuilt chinampas as a research project. They grew vegetables for urban markets and found the yields astonishingly high, sometimes more than conventional soil farming nearby. In a way, the chinampas staged a comeback tour, complete with scientific footnotes. Historians still argue whether chinampas could serve as a sustainable model for modern cities. Could megacities facing climate change and food insecurity revive floating gardens as eco-friendly solutions? Or are they more symbolic heritage than practical blueprint, too fragile in today's polluted waterways? The debate drifts on, sometimes heated, sometimes wistful. You lean back and listen to the willows creak in the breeze. The gardens are still here, green and orderly, yet they hold more than maize and squash. They carry centuries of admiration, skepticism, and longing for sustainable harmony between people and water. The silence of the lake feels like it's waiting for you to decide which story you believe: miracle of productivity, or romantic memory floating on borrowed time. The sun sinks low, painting the water in streaks of orange and violet, and your canoe drifts through the last stretch of chinampas. The fields glow in the evening light, rows of maize catching fire at the tips, squash blossoms curling closed, willows leaning into their own shadows. You feel the day settling, the hush returning, as though the lake itself exhales after centuries of labor. Mainstream history reminds us that the legacy of chinampas is not only agricultural, but cultural. They shaped the survival of Tenochtitlan, influenced the markets and rituals of an empire, and left a mark that endures in Mexico's memory. Even today, songs, festivals, and crafts recall the floating gardens as a symbol of ingenuity and resilience. Here's the quirky tidbit. On modern tourist boats in Xochimilco, some guides joke that you're riding through the Venice of Mexico, but locals prefer to call it simply La Tierra de Flores, the land of flowers. It's a name that stretches back to when whole chinampas were dedicated to blossoms destined for temples and celebrations. Historians still argue whether the chinampas should be remembered as an ecological miracle or as a fragile relic, too romanticized for today's world. Were they the height of sustainable agriculture, or just one of many solutions that happened to flourish in a specific time and place? No final answer will come, but perhaps that's fitting. The gardens, like the debate, float between clarity and mystery. You breathe in the damp night air, scented faintly with soil and lilies. The last paddlers return home, their canoes heavy with harvest. The lake grows still, the fields fade into shadow, and silence takes back the canals. In that hush, you sense the persistence of an old rhythm: earth, water, hands, and patience, weaving survival on the surface of a lake. Now the lake grows darker, the ripples smoothing into glass as the sky fades from orange to deep blue. The chinampas lie quiet, their rows of maize and beans resting beneath the hush of willows. The day's work has ended, the paddles are still, and the voices of farmers have drifted into the night. Let your breathing slow with the rhythm of the water. Imagine the soft creak of a wooden canoe moored at the edge of an island, the faint splash of a fish breaking the surface. Then silence again. The gardens float gently, anchored yet swaying, like the rise and fall of your own breath. You've wandered through fields that seem to hover on water. Watch seedlings pressed into rich soil, and heard the echoes of ceremonies thanking the gods for rain. You've seen Spaniards gape in wonder, and modern farmers carry on the tradition in the quiet canals of Xochimilco. Now, all of it recedes into stillness. Picture yourself lying back in the canoe, the night sky mirrored perfectly in the lake. Stars blink above and below, so that you seem to float in a sky of endless points of light. The willows sway softly at the edges, their roots holding the island steady, their leaves whispering lullabies across the surface. There is nothing more to do, nothing left to tend. The maze stands tall, the canals are calm, the city sleeps beyond the horizon. You can rest too, carried by the same patience that let gardens grow on water for centuries. Close your eyes, let the silence wrap around you, and drift with the floating fields into dreams.